She spent the last $2,200 of her savings. The money she'd been keeping in a coffee tin above the refrigerator, the money her mother had pressed into her hands at the funeral, and said don't you dare waste it, on 51 goats that a livestock auctioneer described, without embarrassment, as a mixed bag of questionable viability. 3 of them were already limping when they came off the trailer. 1 had a cloudy eye. 2 were so thin you could press your thumb between their ribs like piano keys. Her neighbor, a retired feed store operator named Cal Burris, watched the whole unloading from across his fence line and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Nora, honey, what in the world?" She didn't answer him. She just kept counting heads. 51 all present. Her daughter Marisol, 9 years old and standing in the dirt in her school shoes, looked up at her mother and asked if they were going to be okay. Nora looked at the goats, looked at the tin-roofed shed she'd spent 3 weekends patching, looked at her daughter's face, that face that trusted her completely, without condition, the way only a child can trust someone. "Yeah," she said, "we're going to be fine." She didn't believe it yet, but she said it anyway. And sometimes that's where everything begins. I don't write things down because I'm organized. I write things down because if I don't, I start to think I imagined everything, that the things I've seen, the people I've met, the mornings that didn't make any sense, just dissolve back into ordinary life without leaving a mark. My name is Hector Villanueva. I was 43 years old the spring I started working for Nora Vasquez, and I'd been keeping a field log since I was 19, since a foreman named Dobie Reyes handed me a composition notebook on my first day at the Crescent Moon Ranch and said, "Write down what you notice, not what you think, because what you think will change, but what you notice is the truth." I'd been doing that ever since. 40-something notebooks by then. Mostly cattle work, some horse management, 3 years up near Taos doing range consulting. Nothing that required emotional accounting. Just acreage, head counts, weather patterns, medication schedules. Nora's place was going to be different. I didn't know that yet when I turned off the county road onto her gravel drive that first April morning. I just knew it was a small goat operation looking for part-time help. The rate was fair, and I needed the work. What I saw when I pulled in was this: a woman in coveralls standing calf-deep in a pen full of goats, holding one up by its front legs and inspecting its belly like she was reading a map. She was talking to it, not baby talk, actual sentences. The goat was staring at her with the vacant, slightly offended expression goats always wear, and she was just going on like they were having a reasonable conversation. I sat in my truck for a moment, wrote in my log, April 9, first look at Vasquez operation, 40-odd goats, mixed breeds, operator appears to be on speaking terms with the livestock, TBD whether that's a problem. She heard my truck door and looked up. "You Hector?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good, I need a second opinion on this one's hind gut. She's been off feed for 2 days, and I don't like how she's standing." That was my introduction to Nora Vasquez. No pleasantries, no coffee offer, no tour of the property, just, "Look at this goat with me." I went and looked at the goat with her. I learned the shape of the situation in pieces, the way you do when you're new somewhere and people don't volunteer context. You collect it from what they say and what they don't say, from the small decisions they make and the ones they defer. Nora had bought the property 14 months earlier, after her divorce. It was 11 acres in a dry grass valley about 20 minutes from a town called Orvada, the kind of town that shows up on maps but barely justifies it. A gas station, a feed store, a diner that closed at 2 in the afternoon, a VFW hall that was open 3 nights a week for reasons nobody fully explained. The land had a house on it, a creek-fed water situation that was reliable 8 months of the year and dicey the other 4, and a collection of outbuildings in varying states of structural confidence. She had one daughter, Marisol, who was 9 that spring and attended the elementary school in Orvada, which was close enough that she could ride the bus. Nora's ex-husband was not part of the picture in any meaningful way. There was child support that arrived sometimes and didn't arrive other times. There was no one else. She'd worked as a veterinary technician for 11 years in Phoenix before the divorce. That was where most of her animal knowledge came from. She wasn't a vet. She was careful to say that. She was not trained in diagnostics and she knew her limits. But she knew how bodies worked, how an animal moved when it was sick versus when it was hurting versus when it was just being difficult. And she knew how to handle them without escalating their fear. That skill, it turned out, was going to matter more than almost anything else. The goats had come from an estate auction in February. A rancher named Paulson had died without heirs, and his operation, which had once been respectable, or so people said, had been liquidated piece by piece. The goats were the last lot. Nobody serious wanted them because anybody who looked at them could see they'd been underfed and undermanaged for at least 2 seasons. The man who'd been hired to maintain things after Paulson's health declined had done a poor job, and it showed in every animal that walked off that trailer. Nora had gone to the auction without planning to buy goats. She'd gone because she was thinking about a small dairy operation, maybe 3 or 4 animals, just enough to learn on, to see if the idea she'd been turning over for 2 years had any substance. She had a notebook with her that day, the same way I always have mine, except hers had market research in it. Milk pricing, artisan cheese demand, farmers' market schedules in the region. One folded printout from a university extension office about small-scale dairy goat profitability. The auctioneer started the bidding at $300 for the lot. 51 animals, all of them thin, several visibly ill. Nobody raised a hand. He dropped it to $250, then $200. Still nothing. She told me later it was maybe our 4th week working together and we were cleaning out the medical kit, and she got this look on her face like she was still a little baffled by herself. She said, "I don't know what I was thinking. I genuinely don't. I told myself I just felt bad for them. But I don't think that was all of it." She'd raised her hand at 180. The auctioneer, surprised enough that he almost missed it, had knocked them down to her fast. $2,160. Plus the cost of renting a livestock trailer, plus the gas, plus the first round of medications they were going to need almost immediately. The coffee tin had $300 and change left in it after. By the time I came on in April, she'd had the goats for 6 weeks, and the situation had shifted from emergency to merely precarious. She'd lost 4 in the first 10 days. One of them, a Nigerian dwarf cross with a bad respiratory infection that had probably been brewing for weeks, died the first night in the shed while Nora sat with her. She didn't tell me this in a dramatic way. She mentioned it the way you mention something that happened and changed something in you, matter-of-factly, while we were talking about something else. "I'd already named her," she said. "Stupid thing to do. You name them and then you feel it worse." "You keep naming them anyway," I said. She looked at me. "Of course I do." The 47 who remained, she'd started calling them the 47 like they were a unit, which in some ways they were in various stages of recovery. She'd spent those first 6 weeks doing almost nothing else. She'd pulled Marisol into it on weekends, not because she needed the help, but because, as she told me later, she didn't want her daughter to think that hard things were done alone. She'd been on the phone with the county extension office twice a week. She'd driven 3 hours round trip twice for vet consultations she couldn't entirely afford. She'd kept a log of every animal, weight, appetite, stool consistency, behavioral changes, in a binder that she kept on the kitchen counter because, she said, she didn't trust herself to remember everything and she didn't want to miss a pattern. I asked to see the binder on my 2nd day. It was meticulous, better than some cattle operations 3 times the size I'd consulted for. Every goat had a page. Every page had a timeline. She'd flagged the ones still worrying her with a small red tab, and there were 9 red tabs, and I went through those 9 pages carefully and realized she'd already identified every issue I would have flagged and had a treatment approach in motion. I wrote in my log that afternoon, "She knows what she's doing. The operation is underfunded and understaffed, but the management quality is high. She's ahead of where I'd expect someone 6 weeks in to be. The question isn't whether she can do this. The question is whether she can hold it together long enough for the goats to give her something back." That was the question. The goats were a long-term investment. Dairy operations don't pay off in weeks. They pay off in months, in years, in the slow accumulation of herd quality and milk volume and market relationships. Nora had spent most of her reserves getting to this point, and the goats weren't producing anything yet. Most of them were too compromised to be bred, and the few that were producing were only giving minimal milk, enough for their kids but not enough for sale. She was living on savings and on what little child support arrived, and on some informal income I didn't ask about directly. I found out later she'd sold her car, kept a 10-year-old pickup, sold the better car she'd had in December before the auction to pad the account. When I drove past the house at 7 in the morning my first week, the kitchen light was already on. When I left at 5, it was still on. Sometimes when I looked up from the pens, I could see her silhouette moving past the window, and I could tell she wasn't resting. She was planning, calculating, running numbers against numbers, the way you do when you're trying to find the arrangement that makes everything work. The goat with the cloudy eye was named Perpetua. She was a Saanen cross, mostly white, with a disposition that could most charitably be described as complicated. She didn't like to be handled. She bit, not the savage bite of a genuinely aggressive animal, but the irritable, deliberate bite of an animal that had decided that cooperation was optional. She had an infected eye that had probably been left untreated for months, and would require consistent twice-daily treatment for at least 4 weeks to clear, and every single one of those treatments was going to be a negotiation. Nora was the only one Perpetua tolerated. I watched her do the eye treatment that second morning. The goat was in a small pen near the shed, separate from the others. Nora came in with the medication, and Perpetua immediately moved to the far corner and gave her a look of profound suspicion. Nora sat down in the dirt. Not crouched, sat down fully in her coveralls in the dirt of the pen and just stayed there. After about 4 minutes, Perpetua moved. Not toward her, just sideways slightly, in the way animals sometimes shift when their curiosity starts to outrun their caution. Nora didn't move. Another 2 minutes. The goat took 2 steps closer. Nora still didn't move. The goat came and sniffed her knee, then her shoulder, then the medication bottle in her hand, which earned a full retreat to the far corner again. Nora waited. This went on for 20 minutes. I stopped what I was doing and watched from outside the fence because I wasn't sure I'd seen anything like it. Not the method, which I'd seen variations of, but the patience. The absolute zero frustration patience. When Perpetua finally allowed the treatment, because she did eventually come back and stand still and accept it, as if she'd decided the negotiation was over and the terms were acceptable, Nora thanked her. Out loud, 2 words, "Thank you." And then she got up and walked out without any ceremony, and I almost wrote it down as a joke to myself, but I didn't, because it hadn't felt like a joke at all. I asked her about it later. "She's been sick for a long time," Nora said. "And in that time, being handled probably meant something uncomfortable was happening. So she learned that being handled was bad. I just have to teach her something different. It takes a while, but they remember. Once they know you're not going to hurt them, they change." She was talking about the goat. I wasn't entirely sure. The spring was cold and dry, which was hard on the herd, but also meant the pasture grasses were sparse, which forced us to manage feed costs more carefully than Nora had budgeted for. She'd planned on lighter supplemental feeding by April. Instead, we were still supplementing heavily, and the cost was running almost 30% above her projections. I watched her realize this in real time one evening when I stayed late to help with a lame doe. She'd pulled out the binder and was going through the feed receipts she kept folded inside the back cover, and she got very quiet, and the way she got quiet was different from her normal thinking quiet. It was the kind of quiet that means the math isn't working. I didn't say anything for a while. We finished treating the lame doe. Then she said, "I might have to sell some of the equipment." I said, "What equipment?" She looked at me with an expression that was almost amused. "The good milking stand, the one I built over the winter, and probably the stainless steel collection tank I got from the Hendersons' estate sale." I knew what that tank meant. Without it, she couldn't scale. She could do small batch, bucketan bottle, farmer's market quantity, but the tank was what made the idea of an actual dairy operation possible. Without it, she was just keeping goats. "Let me look at the numbers," I said. "You don't need to do that, Hector." "I know I don't need to." "Let me look at them." She handed me the binder with the expression of someone who knows the numbers aren't going to change just because someone else looks at them, but who is too tired to argue. I looked at the numbers. She was right that they were tight, but she'd underestimated a couple of things in one direction and overestimated in another, and when I reworked the feed schedule and looked at what 2 of the does could realistically produce if we pushed their recovery timeline a little more aggressively, there was a version where the tank stayed and the stand stayed, and she made it to June. June wasn't a solution, but June was something. I showed her. She looked at my math for a long time. Then she looked up and said, "You reworked my rotation schedule." Yes, that means you're here 6 days a week instead of 4. I noticed that. Hector, the rate's the same, I said. We'll call 2 of those days consulting. I'll write you an invoice. She opened her mouth, closed it. I said, don't make it weird. She laughed. It was the first time I'd heard her really laugh, and it was startled and genuine, and she covered her mouth after, like she'd forgotten for a moment that she was allowed. I wrote in my log that night, April 23, reviewed financials, extended weekly commitment, told myself it was because the operation has potential, which is true. Also told myself that's the only reason, which is probably less true. The goats are getting better. She's getting better. Something here is worth seeing through. Marisol came home from school on Fridays and went straight to the pen. She had her own favorites. Every kid does with animals, they can't help it. And her favorite was a young alpine doe she'd named Biscochito, which was both the name of a New Mexico cookie and a word her grandmother had used for her when she was small. And she'd told me that story once, seriously and carefully, the way children explain things they want you to understand properly. Biscochito had been one of the worst cases in February. She'd arrived with a fever and a parasitic load that made Nora grimace when she ran the first fecal test. For 3 weeks she'd been touch and go, and Nora had told Marisol gently that sometimes they did everything right, and the animal still didn't make it. And Marisol had listened and nodded and gone back out and sat with the doe anyway. By April, Biscochito was the healthiest animal in the pen. Not because of any single treatment. Because Marisol had spent every Friday afternoon and every Saturday morning sitting in the pen with her, talking to her, bringing her little handfuls of fresh hay, just being present in that uncomplicated way that children are present with things they love, with their whole selves, without management or strategy. I don't know if that's why the doe recovered. I'm too practical to say something like love healed her. But I know the doe's appetite improved significantly in the weeks when Marisol started spending time with her. And I know that appetite matters more than almost anything else in a recovery. And I know that animals are not simple creatures who only respond to medicine. I wrote, Marisol's influence on Biscochito's recovery cannot be quantified, noting it anyway. By the end of April, we had 11 does in acceptable condition for the beginning of a breeding plan. Not this season, the timing was off, and they weren't strong enough, but for fall, for kids born in winter, for milk that would come in the following spring. Nora had started making small batch cheese, just to learn, she said, just to see what she was working with. She had a small setup in the kitchen, nothing that would meet commercial licensing standards, just enough to practice. She made chèvre and a soft, ripened round she was working on improving, and she'd bring samples out to the shed when we were doing the afternoon feeding and leave them on the fence post and not say anything. And after a while, I'd try one and she'd watch my face and I'd say what I thought, and she'd nod and go back inside and adjust something. The chèvre was good from the beginning. Actually good, not good for a first try, but good in an actual way, the kind of good that makes you eat a second piece before you've decided to. I told her that. She said, it's the milk. The milk is different from these animals. I don't know why yet, but it is. I didn't know enough about dairy chemistry to tell her whether she was right or whether she wanted to be right, and that was coloring what she tasted. But I knew what I tasted, and what I tasted was worth paying attention to. In late April, Perpetua's eye cleared. Not completely, there was a small scar on the cornea that would probably stay, a faint cloud in the blue-gray of her iris that would always be there. But the infection was gone. The inflammation was gone. She could see properly from that eye again. I came in the morning and Nora was standing at the fence of Perpetua's pen, and Perpetua was standing right at the fence line, not in the corner, right at the wire, and she was watching Nora with what I can only describe as considered attention, the way animals look at people who have earned some specific revision in how they've categorized them. She came to me this morning, Nora said. First time, she just walked right up to the fence and stood there. I looked at the goat. The goat looked at me with magnificent suspicion and then turned her attention back to Nora. Told you, I said, once they know you're not going to hurt them. Nora reached through the wire and Perpetua didn't move. Let herself be touched along the jaw, along the neck, with the resigned and dignified air of an animal who has decided that this is acceptable and would prefer you not make a big deal of it. 47, Nora said quietly. Not to me, not to the goat, just out loud to herself or to the morning or to the thing she'd been counting and recounting since February. I didn't ask what she meant, I knew. 47 still here. 47 who'd made it through 6 weeks of recovery, through cold and feed shortages and uncertain math, and one woman's absolute refusal to accept that she'd made a mistake. Not 47 saved, not 47 victories. 47 still in the question. The spring was barely half over. The herd wasn't producing. The tank was still in the shed, not yet certain of staying. The numbers were still tight. The coffee tin was empty. But Perpetua was standing at the fence with her cleared eye, looking at Nora like she'd decided something. And Nora was looking back. There's a version of this story I could tell where everything follows logically from everything else, where the recovery of the herd connects cleanly to the first good milk test, which connects to the farmer's market, which connects to the day a woman named Dana Kessler tasted the Chèvre and set something in motion that none of us expected. That's not how it felt from inside it. From inside it, the summer was mostly just hard. I need to say that plainly because I think people who weren't there, and I was there, I have the logbooks, I have 47 pages of heat and setback, and 1 week in July where I genuinely wasn't sure the whole thing was going to hold. Sometimes get told the story in the version where the hardness was just atmosphere, just backdrop, just the dramatic dressing around the success. It wasn't atmosphere. It was the thing itself. The hardness was most of what happened that summer, and the moments that changed things were small and quiet and easy to miss, unless you were paying the right kind of attention. The summer started with water, or the lack of it. June brought heat that arrived 10 days early and stayed. The creek that fed Nora's property, reliable 8 months, she'd told me, and I'd noted that as a flag back in April, dropped to a thin channel by the 3rd week of June and was functionally useless for the herd by July. This meant hauling water. This meant a cost she hadn't planned for, not at this volume, not with 50-something animals in the kind of heat that made their water consumption spike. We worked out a system. A tank truck service out of Orvada could deliver twice a week at a rate that hurt but didn't break, if we were careful everywhere else. Cal Burris, the retired feed store operator who'd watched the unloading back in February and said, "Nora, honey, what in the world?" turned out to be more useful than his skepticism had suggested. He had a water connection on his property that could supply a partial supplement if we ran a temporary line, and he offered it without being asked, showing up one morning in his truck with a roll of agricultural hose and saying, "I figure that creek of yours is about done," and going from there. I asked him once why he'd pivoted so completely from skeptic to volunteer. He thought about it. "Those goats looked terrible in February," he said. "I figured she'd lose most of them and sell the rest and move on, but she didn't lose most of them, and once you see that, you start wondering what else you were wrong about." I wrote that down exactly as he said it. The breeding plan had started in the fall before my time, and the results were coming due in late spring and early summer. Kids born in March and April, does coming into milk, the first real opportunity for production. The first full milk test happened in late May, and I drove Nora to the state extension lab because she was too nervous to go alone and wouldn't admit it. She sat in the passenger seat with the cooler containing the samples in her lap and didn't talk much, which was different. Nora, when she was comfortable, was someone who talked while she was thinking, who talked through problems, who narrated her reasoning in the useful way that some people do where the narration actually helps them think. When she was quiet, something was wrong. I said, "What are you afraid of?" She looked out the window. "That it's not as good as I think it is. And if it isn't, then I need to know that and adjust. So you'll be okay either way." I didn't say I'd be okay, I said I'd adjust. She was quiet a moment. "There's a difference." The results came back 10 days later. I was in the shed when she opened the email on her phone, and she didn't say anything for so long that I looked up from what I was doing. Her face was very still. "Nora, the fat content is high," she said. "Really high, above what most commercial goat dairy runs." She was reading, processing, her eyes moving. "The protein profile is they're noting the protein profile. They don't usually note things unless they're significant." "What does that mean?" "It means the cheese I've been making isn't just good because I'm getting better at making it." She finally looked up. "It's the milk. I was right. The milk is different." I stood there for a moment, trying to determine what I was looking at. It wasn't joy exactly. It was more complicated than joy. It was the expression of someone who had bet on something she couldn't prove, had lived inside that bet through cold and water shortages and financial terror, and had just found out that the thing she'd believed was real. Not one, not yet, just confirmed. She sat down on the edge of the milking stand and put her face in her hands. Not crying, just breathing, just sitting inside the moment and letting it be what it was. I went back to what I'd been doing, gave her a minute. I need to explain something about why the milk was different, because I didn't understand it until the extension agent, a thin, precise woman named Velasco who drove out in July and walked the property with a clipboard and asked questions Nora answered faster and more confidently than I expected, explained it in terms that finally made sense to me. The Paulson goats, as we'd started calling them, not a flattering name, named for the man who'd let them decline, but it had stuck, were a mixed and somewhat accidental genetic portfolio. Paulson had apparently spent 20 years crossbreeding without a particularly systematic plan, chasing slightly different traits each time a new animal came available, selling and buying on impulse. What he'd ended up with, by the time the herd was dispersed, was a collection of animals that didn't fit neatly into any commercial category, but that carried, in their combined genetics, a fatty acid profile in their milk that was unusual, and as Velasco put it, commercially interesting in the current artisan market. Translation: their milk made cheese that tasted like something. Not just edible, not just adequate, something you noticed, something you remembered. The neglect almost erased it, Velasco said. She was standing at Perpetua's fence, looking at the herd in the afternoon pasture. Another year in those conditions and you'd have lost the production entirely. You'd have the genetics, but the bodies couldn't have expressed them. The window was very narrow. Nora was standing next to her, and I saw her absorb this, the idea that the window had been narrow, that she'd arrived at the auction at precisely the moment when arriving mattered. She said, "I didn't know any of that when I bought them." Velasco looked at her. "No, but you treated them right when you had them, and that's what let it come through." She paused. "That's not nothing." The farmers' market started in June. Not because the operation was ready for it. It wasn't, not fully. But because Nora had applied in March, paid the stall fee and committed, and backing out would have meant refunding the commitment and losing the season entirely, and she couldn't afford to lose the season. She had at that point enough milk production to make approximately 40 to 60 units per week of her chèvre, small rounds, 8-ounce, wrapped in paper she'd had printed with a simple label she'd designed herself. A drawing of a goat in the corner, her name, the name she'd given the operation. She'd called it Mesa Blanca Dairy, named for nothing specific, she said. Named for the way the land looked in late afternoon, when the light went flat and the scrub grass went silver and the horizon looked like a long, clean line someone had drawn with a very steady hand. The first Saturday, she came home from the market with $63. The second Saturday, 112. Small numbers, I know how they sound, but they weren't small in the way they felt, because each of those dollars was proof that the thing she'd built was real enough that strangers were willing to exchange money for it, and that matters differently than any other kind of evidence. She split the farmers' market money into 3 piles each Saturday. Operating costs, Marisol's school supplies fund she'd fallen behind on, and what she called the rainy day tin. Not the coffee tin from before, that was empty, but a new tin, a bigger one, a repurposed cookie tin with a lid she'd bent back into shape after Marisol had sat on it. I don't know why I found that detail so specific. The bent lid she'd fixed rather than replaced. I wrote it down. In July, 2 things happened. The first, one of the does, a Nubian Alpine cross we called Delia, because Marisol had gone through a phase of naming the goats after her teachers, developed mastitis in 1 quarter. Not severe, catchable early because Nora's observation protocol was rigorous, but requiring immediate treatment and a temporary reduction in her production. It was a setback in the small, grinding way that summer was mostly setbacks, not catastrophic, just more weight on a structure already carrying a lot. The second, Dana Kessler came to the market. Dana Kessler was the regional buyer for a specialty grocery cooperative that operated 7 stores across 3 states. She was not in Orvada doing grocery work. She was visiting family, and she went to the market because her nephew wanted kettle corn, and she walked past Nora's table because she walked past everything, because Dana Kessler was constitutionally incapable of walking past a cheese display without stopping. I wasn't there. I've reconstructed this from what Nora told me, from what Dana told me later when I finally met her, and from Marisol, who was working the table that day and whose account was the most detailed, because Marisol noticed things the way children do when they've been trained by proximity to a parent who notices things. Dana stopped, picked up a round of the Chèvre, read the label, asked as buyers always ask about the milk source, the process, the animal feed. Nora answered. Dana asked if she could taste it. Nora unwrapped a sample. Dana ate it, stood there for a moment, ate a second piece. Then she said, "What's the fat content on the milk?" Nora told her the number from the May test. Dana looked at her. "Are you licensing?" "Working toward it," Nora said. "We're small." "How small?" Nora told her. Dana said, "Can I have your card?" Nora's card was a piece of cardstock she'd printed at the library, cut with scissors, which meant the edges weren't quite even. She gave Dana one. Dana looked at it carefully, the way someone looks at a thing when they're trying to understand what they're actually looking at, the object and the person behind it simultaneously. She said, "I'm going to give you my card. Don't call me for a while. Focus on getting your licensing in order. When you're ready, call me." She walked away. Marisol, who had watched all of this without saying a word, waited until Dana was out of earshot and then said, "Mom, who was that?" "I don't know yet," Nora said. She held the card with both hands. Business card, heavy stock, the cooperative's logo embossed on the front. The name, the title, the contact information that represented something she'd been working toward without knowing how to name it. She held it for a while, then she put it in her front pocket and went back to selling cheese. I found out about Dana that evening. Nora told me while we were doing the afternoon feeding, in the same tone she used for everything, not understated exactly, but level, factual, letting the weight of the thing carry itself without dressing it up. I stopped what I was doing. "She's a regional buyer," Nora said. 7 stores. "I know what that is, Nora." I told her we were small. "You told her you were working toward licensing." "I am working toward licensing." "How far along are you?" She gave me a look that was mostly honest. "I have the application." "The application?" "I've had it for 3 months. I've been filling it out, a beat, slowly." I sat down on the feed bin. The goats, indifferent to commercial pivots, continued eating. "What's been slowing you down?" "The facility requirements." She sat down on the milking stand, which had become the default place in the shed where we had conversations that required sitting. "The state requires a dedicated production space, separate from the house, separate ventilation, certified surfaces, a specific sink setup." "I've been pricing it," she looked at her hands. "I've been pricing it for a long time." I knew what that meant. Pricing it and doing the math and finding that the number was larger than what was available and putting the application back in the folder. "What's the number?" I asked. She told me. It was significant. Not impossible, but it required capital she didn't have and couldn't currently borrow. It was the next gate, the gate between where she was and where the card in her pocket pointed. We sat there for a moment in the shed with the goats, and the late afternoon light coming through the gaps in the boards, and the smell of hay and milk, and the specific, close warmth of a lot of living things in one space. "You have time," I said. She said, "Don't call for a while." She didn't say how long. "Long enough to solve this." "You don't know that." "No," I said, "but I know you built 47 goats from nothing in 8 months. I'm not sure the production facility is actually the harder problem." She looked at me. I was maybe overstating it, but I believed what I said, and she could tell, and something in her face shifted slightly in the direction of a thing she might, with enough time and enough luck, almost come to believe. The rest of July was harder than I'm going to describe in full detail. The heat didn't break until the first week of August. Delia's mastitis cleared, but we had 2 more cases, lower severity, and the collective strain on the herd's production schedule knocked Nora's market output down for 3 weeks at the worst possible time, when she'd been building a customer base that expected consistent supply. She lost 6 regular customers in those 3 weeks. Not because they were angry, they understood small operations, but because they found another source and stayed with it, the way people do when convenience aligns with inertia. She didn't talk about it much. She tracked it in the binder, she tracked everything in the binder, and she adjusted her projections and she kept going. There was one evening in late July when I came back to the property late, after a parts run to the next town for a repair I couldn't defer, and the light was still on in the shed. I went in and found Nora in the corner of the big pen, on the ground, with 3 does settled around her like they'd simply decided to include her in wherever they were resting. She wasn't asleep. She was just sitting there in the company of the animals, with her head back against the wall and her eyes open, and her expression doing something complicated. I almost walked out, felt like I'd walked into something private. But she heard me and looked up, and her expression went back to normal, or what passed for normal with Nora, which included a certain quality of tiredness she wore like something she'd accepted. "Long day," I said, because there wasn't anything better to say. "Long summer." "Yep." I sat down on the other side of the pen. One of the does shifted and lay down closer to me, which I noted without comment. "I keep thinking about February," she said, "about the auction." "What about it?" "About what I was thinking, what I told myself I was thinking." She turned her head to look at me. "I think the truth is I looked at those goats and I saw something that needed someone to believe in it, and I thought if I didn't, nobody would." She paused. "That's a terrible reason to spend $2,000 you don't have." "Is it?" "It's not rational." "No," I said, "but the rational version of that day leaves those goats with somebody who doesn't care enough to recover them. And then that milk profile, that thing Velasco was excited about, that stays buried, or it dies with the herd." I looked at the goats around us. Rational had a different outcome. She thought about that for a long moment. Then she said, "Hector, do you think this is going to work?" I didn't answer immediately. I sat with it, the way she deserved me to sit with it, without padding or performance. "I think," I said finally, "that you have built something that has value. Real value in the milk in the herd, in what you know now that you didn't know in February. I think the question of whether it works depends on things that are partly in your hands and partly not. I think the things in your hands you're doing right." She was quiet. "That's not a yes," she said. "No, it's not." She nodded slowly. One of the does shifted its head into her lap and she put her hand on it, absently, the way you touch something familiar. "Okay," she said, not to me, to something else, something she was working out internally. She sat there a while longer. I sat there with her. The call she made from the parking lot. I've written a lot of things in these notebooks over the years, and most of them are practical, weights and rotations, and weather patterns and the kinds of details that matter when you're trying to understand an operation from the inside out. But there are moments I write down differently. Moments where the facts aren't the point, and I know it. The day Nora Vasquez called Dana Kessler is one of those moments. I'll try to do it justice. The production facility took 14 months. Not because Nora was slow, but because the solution she found was the only one that fit the actual shape of her situation. And finding it required the kind of patience that wears on you at a cellular level, the kind where you wake up in the middle of the night and do the math again in your head, even though you know the math hasn't changed since you did it last at 2 in the morning 3 days ago. She couldn't borrow conventionally. Her credit profile after the divorce was not strong, and the operation was too new for most agricultural lending. She applied to a USDA microloan program and was rejected once on a technicality. She'd listed the wrong livestock classification code on a secondary form and approved on the reapplication 9 months later. The amount was less than what she needed. She made up the difference through 3 things. A small grant from a regional agricultural development organization that Velasco had told her about almost as an afterthought at the end of her July visit. Money from Cal Burris, offered as an investment rather than a loan, on terms he named himself, which were so favorable that Nora cried in his truck, which embarrassed them both. And 4 months of renting out the extra bedroom in her house to a schoolteacher doing a long-term substitute placement at the Orvada Elementary School, which was awkward and imperfect and necessary. She built the production space in the fall and winter of the 2nd year. using a contractor who specialized in small agricultural facilities, and who, it turned out, had grown up on a goat farm and had a sentimental affection for the whole category of enterprise that led to him doing certain things at cost and not mentioning it. The licensing inspection happened in February of the third year. She passed on the first try. I found out because my phone rang at 9:30 in the morning. I was on another property that day doing an assessment, and it was Nora, and she said, "I passed." And then she didn't say anything else for about 8 seconds, and I understood those 8 seconds completely. I said, "You called the right person." She laughed, and it was the same laugh as that first one in April, 2 years earlier, startled and genuine, like she kept forgetting she was allowed. She waited 2 weeks after the licensing before she called Dana Kessler. I know why she waited. She didn't say it directly, but I understood it. She wanted to hold the moment between having the thing and asking for something with the thing. She'd been working toward the call for a year and a half. She wanted a few days to exist in the space where she had what she'd been building toward before she opened the next gate, which might not open, which might reveal that the buyer's interest hadn't survived the time, or that her operation was still too small, or that the market had moved. She made the call from the parking lot of the Orvada grocery store. I know because Marisol told me. Marisol was 12 by then, old enough to understand more of the shape of things, and she'd been watching the whole enterprise with the particular attention of a kid who has grown up inside an adult's project, who has cleaned pens and fed animals and seen the binder and heard the late-night math and knows exactly how much is riding on something even when nobody talks about it directly. Marisol had been in the grocery store when Nora stopped outside. She came out and found her mother sitting in the driver's seat with the door open and her feet on the pavement, phone in hand, not yet dialing. Marisol got in the passenger side. "Are you about to call that lady?" she asked. "Yes," Nora said. "What if she doesn't remember you?" "She'll remember." "What if she says it's too small?" Nora looked at her daughter. "Then I ask what it would need to be, and I work toward that." Marisol thought about this. "Okay," she said, "call her." Nora looked at the phone. "What if I've been wrong about all of this?" "Mom." "I'm serious. What if it's not as?" "Mom, you're not wrong about the goats. 12 years old. Certain as anything I've ever heard. Call her." Dana Kessler answered on the second ring. She did remember. The conversation, as Nora relayed it to me that evening in the shed while we were doing the feeding. She told it to the goats as much as to me, moving through the pen, touching heads and necks, narrating, lasted 22 minutes. Dana asked questions about the licensing, the production capacity, the herd size, the seasonal milk volume. Nora answered everything, including the things that were not yet fully developed, which she named as such without apology. Dana said she'd need samples, fresh and properly documented. She said she'd need to schedule a facility visit before any contract conversation. She said the timeline was probably 4 to 6 months, which was not fast. Nora said that was fine. Dana said, "The product has stayed with me. I should tell you that. I tasted a lot of cheese that summer. Yours stayed with me." Nora said she'd ship samples by Friday. She hung up. She stood in the parking lot for a long time. Then she drove home. The facility visit happened in May. Dana came with a procurement associate, and they spent 4 hours on the property. They looked at everything: the production space, the herd, the feed management, the milking protocol, the testing records that Nora had maintained since month 1. They tasted the Chèvre in 3 varieties Nora had developed since the summer she'd first started practicing, including a version with local herbs and a firmer aged round she'd been working on for most of the previous year. I was there for the afternoon portion. Nora had asked me to be there, which I understood to mean she wanted someone else present who knew the operation and could answer questions she might not think to answer because she was too close to it. The procurement associate asked me how long I'd been working with the operation. I said almost 3 years. He asked what I thought of the herd management. I said it was the most careful small herd management I'd seen. I said that wasn't sentiment, that I had field logs going back to day 1 if he wanted to see the data, and that the data would show a recovery rate from the original herd's condition that was above what I would have projected. I said the milk quality wasn't an accident and wasn't marketing. It was a traceable result of specific decisions made over a sustained period of time by someone who knew what she was doing. He wrote something in his notebook. Dana, who was standing near Perpetua's area, Perpetua had been integrated into the main herd eventually, mostly on her own terms, watched Nora handle one of the newer does and said, "You have a real relationship with these animals." "They're how I know things are working," Nora said. "If they're doing well, I'm doing something right. If they're not, I need to find out why. And if you can't fix it." "I haven't not been able to fix something yet," she paused. "I've been lucky, and I've been careful, both things." Dana nodded. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the herd in the afternoon pasture, 44 animals now. She'd lost 3 to age and 1 to an injury that couldn't be corrected, and she'd added 8 younger does from a careful purchase the previous spring. "How do you think about this place?" Dana asked. It was an unusual question for a procurement visit. I don't think the associate expected it either. Nora thought about it, not performing thought, actually thinking. "Like something that's alive," she said finally. "Not mine exactly, something I'm responsible for, that I made a commitment to." She looked at the herd. "You can't really explain it from the outside. You'd have to have been here." Dana looked at her. "I believe that," she said. "The contract offer came in August. I was in the shed when Nora called me in from the pasture. She'd got the email on her phone and come to find me immediately, which meant she didn't want to be alone with it for long, which I understood. She handed me her phone. I read the email. I read the attachment, which was a preliminary term sheet. I read the part that specified the initial purchase commitment and the scaling provision and the pricing structure, which was above what she'd been getting at the farmer's market on a per-unit basis and included terms for expansion. I handed her the phone back. We stood there in the shed. "Read me a number," I said. She said a number. It was not a large number in the context of commercial dairy. In the context of the coffee tin, of the $2,000 at the February auction, of the tent and the bent lid and the parking lot, it was enormous. I said, "Is it enough?" "To start," she said, "to make the operation sustainable, to not be doing the math every night." She stopped. "Yeah. It's enough. What do you want to do?" "I want to call my lawyer and make sure I understand what I'm signing." She almost smiled. "I want to tell Marisol, and I want to call my mother." "What about the order of those things?" "Lawyer first," she said. "Then Marisol. My mother will want to talk for 2 hours, and I need to be somewhere comfortable for that." That was practical Nora. That was the version of her I'd watched hold a complicated operation together through 3 years of hard problems. That same quality, not removing herself from the emotion of it, but not letting the emotion prevent the next necessary step. She looked at the herd through the shed opening. The afternoon light on the pasture, that long, flat light she'd named the dairy after. "Hector," she said. "Yeah." "Do you remember April, the first April when you came on?" "I remember. You said you didn't know if I could hold it together long enough for the goats to give something back." She looked at me. "You wrote that in your log. I saw you writing it." I had said exactly that, though not out loud. I'd written it. I hadn't known she'd seen me. "I didn't say that to you," I said. "No, but you thought it." "Yes." She nodded. "I thought it too," she said, "every single day." The contract was signed in September. The first delivery to the co-op's regional distribution went out in October. 40 units of Chevre, 12 of the aged round, 18 of a new semi-soft she'd spent months developing and calling Mesa Blanca Reserve in the label drafts before she finally committed to the name. I drove the first delivery. Nora followed in the truck with Marisol, who had taken the day off school by formal request and not parental fiat, who had written a note to her teacher explaining that her family had a business milestone. The receiving dock at the distribution center was not a dramatic place. It smelled like cardboard and refrigerant and the particular industrial cold of a large storage facility. The receiving agent who signed off on the shipment was professional and unexcited by the transaction, as receiving agents at large facilities tend to be when they are processing one small delivery in a day of many. It didn't matter. We drove back in the afternoon. Marisol fell asleep in the back seat of Nora's truck, which she still did occasionally when she was tired and comfortable, and Nora drove with one hand on the wheel and the window cracked and didn't talk much, which was the thinking quiet, the good kind. Somewhere past the county road turnoff, she said, "I'm going to name one of the spring kids after you." I said, please don't. I'm going to name it Hector. Goats are mostly female. I'll name one of the bucklings Hector. They usually get sent to. One of the does, she said. I'll find a doe and I'll name her Hector. I looked out the window. That's not how naming works. It's my dairy, she said. I name things how I want. The fall settled in the way falls do in that country. Not gradually, but decisively. The heat gone 1 week and the cold real the following week, with a brief and beautiful middle period where the light went amber, and the grass had that particular smell of things completing themselves. The herd was 46 now. Perpetua, who had been among the oldest animals in the original lot, had died in late summer, not suddenly, but with the slow withdrawal of an animal who has decided its time is arriving and doesn't intend to make a scene about it. She'd been found one morning in her usual corner of the pasture, lying on her side, which she very rarely did, and she'd gone sometime in the night. Nora had buried her at the edge of the property near the creek, even though it was the dry part of the year and the ground was hard and it took most of a morning. I helped. We didn't talk much while we worked. After, Nora stood at the grave for a while with her arms crossed and looked at the creek bed. She's why I believed the others could make it, she said. I know that sounds like a lot to put on a goat. It doesn't, I said. She was the worst case, the one that seemed least likely. If I could get her eye to clear, if I could get her to trust me enough to let me treat her, then I thought I could get the rest of them through. She was quiet. She was the proof of concept. I thought about that. She didn't know that. No, Nora said. She was just being a goat, being difficult and suspicious, and then deciding I wasn't going to hurt her. She looked at the grave. That's all it was from her side. From her side. I wrote it down later the way she'd said it, not as commentary, just as fact. From Perpetua's side, it was the simple daily decision of an animal about whether to trust or not trust. And she'd decided, eventually, to trust. And from Nora's side, it had been proof of something that kept her in the bet through 3 years of hard math. Most things work like that, I think. Most things that matter are ordinary from one angle and enormous from another. The first review of the Mesa Blanca Chever appeared on the Co-op's regional email newsletter in November. I read it at Nora's kitchen table. Marisol had printed it because Marisol had started managing a small amount of the social media presence, responsibly, for a 12-year-old, with her mother reviewing everything. And she'd printed the newsletter excerpt and put it on the table under a coffee mug as if she was leaving a note. The review was short. It described the cheese as having a quality that was unusual for small American Chever, a depth of flavor the reviewer associated with the specific character of the milk, a creaminess that felt artisan without feeling precious. The reviewer mentioned the dairy by name. Nora read it 3 times. Then she got up and poured herself coffee and stood at the window looking at the pasture, and I could see the expression on her face from across the table. That particular quality of a person who has arrived somewhere they worked very hard to reach and is standing in it quietly without fanfare, because fanfare has never been the point. Marisol came in and read it over her mother's shoulder and said, "That's pretty good." Nora said, "Yeah." "Are you going to frame it?" Nora thought about it. "Probably not." She looked at Marisol. "What do you think?" Marisol thought seriously. "I think we should put it in the binder." Nora looked at her daughter. The binder, the one that had started with 47 pages of sick goats and a $300 coffee tin and every weight and temperature and behavior note she'd recorded for 3 years. The document of the thing, all of it, the losses and the corrections and the adjusting, the math done and redone and done again. "Yeah," Nora said, "put it in the binder." Marisol took the printout, folded it carefully, went to get the binder from the counter. I finished my work at Mesa Blanca in late November of that year. Not because things went wrong. Because they'd gone right enough that Nora had hired a part-time hand who could cover the daily work, and a dairy consultant who specialized in small herd production scaling, and she didn't need a generalist ranch hand anymore. She needed people with more specific expertise than I had, and she was in a position to afford them. She told me this as directly as she always told me things, which I appreciated. I said, "Good." She said, "I'm going to need a reference letter." "For what?" She gave me a look. "For when other small operations need someone who knows what they're doing." I said I'd write it. On my last day, I went through all the notebooks, 12 of them, that covering, and I looked at what I'd written. The weights and schedules and weather patterns and all the practical record. And the other things. The things I'd written down because they mattered in a way that wasn't practical, because I'd decided somewhere in the process that the practical record wasn't the full story. The last entry read, November 19. Final day at Mesa Blanca, 46 animals in good condition. Operation licensed and contracted, herd genetics documented and preserved. Nora Vasquez has converted a bad bet at a livestock auction into something that will probably outlast both of us. I say probably not because I doubt it, but because I was raised not to speak in absolutes about living things. What I know for certain, she built this without the safety net. She built it when the smart money would have walked away. She built it because she looked at 51 sick goats and decided that the gap between what they were and what they could be was worth the cost of crossing. I have worked with good operators for 20 years, and I have not always seen that. When I have seen it, I have tried to write it down. I closed the notebook, walked out to the pasture. The herd was spread across the afternoon grass, moving in the quiet collective way of animals that are safe and fed and unhurried. The light was going, the way it goes in fall, fast and gold, and then not there. In the middle of the herd, slightly apart from the others, a white Saanen cross stood with her head up, looking at the horizon, the small permanent scar in her cloudy eye catching the last of the light. Not Perpetua, a daughter of Perpetua's, born 2 springs after the old doe's death, who had inherited the Saanen cross and the complicated temperament, and apparently the particular quality of standing apart from the group and looking at things very seriously. Her name was in the herd log. Nora had named her Patience. I stood at the fence for a while and watched the light go. Then I got in my truck and drove back toward the county road, and the thing I wrote in the notebook later that night, before I put it in the box with the others, was just this. She named the doe Patience because she knew what it cost. I don't know if I needed to write anything after that.